Well, welcome to my office. This is where I do most of my work. Um, you're seeing what I see when we're on Zoom right now. The stuff you see is background behind me over there, but this wall here is what I look at. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. The reason I'm making the video here instead of outside or anything is partly for variety, partly laziness, and partly because it's dark out. We've been discussing the problem of dualism and the question of whether the mind and body are united or separate. And in that context, I've been raising an issue that perhaps you've noticed, perhaps you haven't, which is this question about personal identity. What does it mean for me to say that I am me? What does it mean to say that I have unity and continuity over time? What does it mean to say that even though I've changed over the years, I'm still the same person? Now, I've given you a reading to do, and I'm hoping that you'll do it. And if you do that reading, then that'll take a really hard look at this question in very general terms and give you some of the basic responses to it. We'll talk about it in class, and there'll be some work on it. What I want to do right now is talk about a little bit of background to this question by putting it into a slightly different context and talking about how it arose in ancient Greece in the context of some of the very earliest Western philosophers. And in order to discuss this, first of all, I want you to remember that these ancient philosophers are dealing with these kinds of questions for the very first time, at least in a systematic way. These are the very first people to take these kinds of questions and to try to come up with a systematic answer based upon observation and extrapolation from the observation, combined with a logical pattern of reasoning to reach a conclusion. That is the basis for all of philosophy, and not just philosophy, but all of Western thought, essentially. These are processes, and some of the things we're talking about are things that have had an influence right up to the present day. But you need to remember that the philosophers we're going to be talking about here do not know anything at all about physics or biology or chemistry or ecology or any of the things that we take for granted as part of our base knowledge today. Right? They barely know mathematics and geometry. These are things that are just being worked out at the time that we're talking about. So please remember that, and as we move forward, we'll see what we're able to do with it. Okay, so I'm going to take a slight break, and then we'll come back and we'll do it. And we're back. So what I want to do is I want to discuss a few of the issues that come up when we raise these sorts of questions, the type that I've been discussing up to now. The question is this: how is it possible for something to radically change its nature while also remaining what it is? For example, if you take an apple seed and you put it in the soil, you might eventually get an apple tree. Is the seed the same as the tree? Is it the same thing? If it is, then how is that possible that a tiny little seed that's completely different in nature from a tree is the same being, the same entity as the tree? But if it isn't true, then when did the change occur? How did it occur? Why did it occur? What's going on? The issue of identity and change is essentially that kind of issue. And it's a very tricky one. It's something that we can't just take for granted. So what we need to do is we need to think it. Now, Thales, who's reputed to have been the first philosopher, is somebody we don't know very much about, but we know a little bit about him. We know partly through some things that Aristotle had to say. He was cited by some of his contemporaries, or some people who came a few centuries later, and it's for that reason that we're able to talk about him at all. But Thales is reputed to have been the first philosopher in the Western tradition. Aristotle tells us that Thales noticed that things that grow and change and also things that nourish things that grow and change, so food, they tend to be damp. They tend to be moist or wet. And he carried that reasoning along, and he observed other things in the world. He concluded that probably everything was essentially made of water. And the reason things were able to retain their identity while also changing was that they were all made of the same basic primordial stuff, that is to say, water. Now, this is what we call monism. Monism is a thesis that you hold when you claim that everything is basically made from one thing. Monism can take a lot of forms. In this case, it took the form of somebody saying that the world is basically made up of water and things derived from water. In future generations, other things were proposed. For example, a proposal came along that said that wind was, or air was, the basic criterion. This was something that a philosopher a couple of generations later said, named Anaximenes. He proposed that that the different densities of air could explain the different things that exist. So you have air in general, which can become fire, which can then become wind, which can become clouds, which can become other things, all the way through to stone and metal. And that the differences we're looking at are differences of density. And he had an argument that he followed through in order to get there. He observed things like evaporation and the way the evaporated water dissipates into the air, but also the way in which water falls down from the sky, from clouds. He noticed that clouds appear to be some kind of more condensed or denser air, and he believed that he could show through a cause and effect kind of relationship that that everything was connected to everything else because it was all made of the same stuff, which was air. This is the same kind of thesis as Thales, with a different kind of element that's proposed. It's another form of monism. But I want you to notice something here. I want you to notice that we're applying a principle that has become a principle that we use today, that we've used in the ancient world, that has been attributed to people like Leibniz and others, but that comes from the most ancient sources. And that's what we call the principle of sufficient reason. Now, the principle of sufficient reason is essentially this, that nothing happens without something making it happen. Every effect has a cause. Nothing happens for no reason. This is something that we can know that as a principle of science. It's also a principle of philosophy. It's a principle of life. We just generally accept it. But it was actually a philosopher named Anaximander who came between Thales and Anaximenes who came up with this theory. And basically what he was saying was, look, Thales, perhaps you're right that water is the basis of everything, but we still have to explain how it is that things change. Why do things change? Not just what's the material they're all made of that allows them to change, but what is it that causes the change in the first place? That's because of the principle of sufficient reason. Nothing ever happens without something making it happen. In his case, Anaximander proposed that things change because of the effect of conflicting opposites. So, for example, hot meets cold, soft meets hard, wet meets dry. So if you take dry salt and you put it into a wet medium, the salt will dissipate into the medium. The effect of the contrast, the conflict between these opposites, wet and dry, these opposites enter into conflict and something changes. Or if you take cold water, put it in a cauldron, put fire underneath it, and then just wait a while, the hot and the cold will connect together, enter into conflict, and create the boiling and the steam. And the heat, of course, as we know, is transferred to the water. Now, this principle of sufficient reason is something that comes from the ancient world, and it becomes one of the major principles of thought in the modern world. Philosophers look at the world and they look at the evidence that they're faced with. They apply principles of thought that are believed to apply generally. They apply a logical thought process and they follow the argument along until they reach the conclusion that the argument leads them to. And whatever that conclusion is what the philosopher assumes to be true. So you have these basic monistic principles that we've been discussing. And there are other principles of a similar kind. You might not think of this as monism, but it is. For example, Democritus, another philosopher, believed that the universe was made up of tiny little particles called atoms. And the word atom is connected to a word meaning undividable or unsplittable or unbreakable. And he believed that the entire universe was made up of these tiny little pieces which came together and formed larger macro objects, if you will. And so, again, what we have is an idea that the entire universe is basically made up of one thing. And if you observe that it breaks down and that things can combine to create other things, but also that the universe appears to be made of things that are building blocks of other things. You can break that down and you can actually propose that the whole universe is made up of these tiny little particles called atoms. Oddly enough, that's not that far away from the kind of thing we believe today. Then along came Parmenides. Now, Parmenides thought that his predecessors had basically made a fundamental mistake. The thing that they'd gotten wrong was that they had not seen that the problem of change, remember we're talking about the problem of identity and change, how do things change while remaining the same? He said that they didn't see that the problem of change is connected to the problem of essentially quantity. How is it possible that one thing can also be many things? Take, for example, a glass of water. If you walk to the ocean and you take your glass, and you dip it into the ocean, and you're holding up a glass of ocean water now. The question is the water in the glass part of the ocean or not? What has changed? What's changed is you went from 1 to 2. But if you put it back in the ocean, of course, it goes back to being 1. And you can never draw the same glass out again. Now, that's not Parmenides' example, that's mine. But the thing is that this kind of problem of one thing being able to be broken into many pieces and then recombined again points to the idea that the problem of change is not a problem of how things change or what causes the change, but rather a question of what it is that's going on at all when we talk about change. So for Parmenides, the basic thing that everything else is made of is being itself. It's not some element in the universe. It's not some part of reality. It's not water or air or fire. It's not atoms. It's nothing physical. It becomes a metaphysical problem, and we start saying that being itself is what is the basic building block of the universe. Everything in the universe is being. Now, there's a lot to this, and I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on it because it can be very complex. But essentially, if everything in the universe is basically explained at this level of, at this ontological level, this metaphysical level of being, then change is probably an illusion. Change probably doesn't really happen. It's just what our minds interpret the world to be doing so that we can make sense of what's going on. But actual real change doesn't happen. That appears to be what's going on. So Parmenides denied that change was a real thing. Essentially, when things appear to change from one state to another, the change is something we are perceiving, but we are being deceived by our senses. The change isn't real. So nothing ever actually changes. Now, we can put alongside that a competing vision. And this is a very famous competition between these two positions, because Parmenides is talking about the continuity of things. Everything is what it is, and the change it appears to go through is just an illusion. But Heraclitus, on the other hand, is reputed to have said, you can never step into the same river twice. It's not change that's the illusion, it's sameness. Things are always changing. They never stay the same. And with Heraclitus, we have the first instance not of monism, but of pluralism. Heraclitus believes that the universe is made up of many, many things, which are always interacting with each other and always changing from one thing into another thing. And so that for Heraclitus, change is the continual condition of everything that exists. So you have this conflict now between the monist Parmenides and the pluralist Heraclitus, and the one of them is saying that change is an illusion, the other one is saying that change is the only thing that's real, and that sameness is an illusion. Now, Heraclitus has a problem because he has to think about what unites everything. If everything is always changing, then doesn't that just mean that everything's kind of exploding all around us? How can he claim that everything is always changing when everything appears to be remaining unified? Well, he proposes that there is a principle of reality called logos. And logos is logos is the organizing principle of the universe. It is the thing that we are looking for when we're trying to study the universe. And it's also the way in which we study the universe. We have to connect with logos to study the universe, and logos is what we find when we study it. What is logos? Well, logos is a Greek word. It means literally word. It can mean a principle, a reason, it can be a word, a thought, a meaning. It has a lot of different senses like that. And when you think about the idea of logos as the ultimate organizing principle of the universe, essentially what you can say, if you wish, that the universe has essentially a rational organizing principle that allows it to remain unified while continually changing. So what we have is essentially, and again, it's very complex. So what we have is Heraclitus essentially claiming that everything is always changing, and Parmenides essentially claiming that everything is always remaining the same, that nothing actually ever changes. So you have continual flux versus a stasis. And the question is, who's right? Now, I've skipped over a lot of details, and in many ways I've given a very simple or even a simplistic account of what's going on in these thinkers. And in the next video, what I'm going to do is talk about how Plato took the ideas of Heraclitus and Parmenides and combined them into his theory of forms, at least in the opinion of many people. And that's for the next video. We're not going to do that right now. So I hope you have a good day, and I will see you by Zoom pretty soon.